Pedestrian and Sustainability Advisory Board, today, July 8th. Please, if you have a cell phone, make sure it's silenced. We're going to go through a review from the POCO and the master plan, and then the boards will have an opportunity to discuss, and then we'll take public comment. For any public comments, please state your name and address when you come up to the mic. Roll call.
Davis.
Here. Other boards? Pedestrian? You can.
Okay, Brad Brown, not present. Jay Stingle, not present. Vicki Redlin. James Michelson. Here. Benjamin Renner, not present. Adam Belcarelli.
Here.
Margie Davey. Here. Michelle Bogdan-Mutzel. Not present. Pat Dwyer-Hallquist, not present. Lurton Blassingame. Eric DeGroot, not present. Adam Mislowski. Jake Krause, not present. Robert Turner. Vic Oliver, not present.
Presentation, want to start?
You want to start?
So I put some extra mics around, and because of the large group, obviously we're going to have to share the microphones. If you have one of the wireless, I turned it on, so it's going to be live the whole time. So if you want to give some input or speak, grab one of those. If you have one of the typical mics, make sure you turn it on before you speak, and just make sure you can share it with your colleagues. Thank you for everybody for showing up. It's an exciting time for the city, and hopefully all the boards and committee members have been keeping track of where we are in the process. We have Nathan, who's with Smith Group here this evening. He's really going to be taking the lead on the meeting, doing some of the presentation, and then a little bit of moderating and kind of letting you know what we'd like to see from tonight. And again, if you're here from the public and want to make comments, the board is going to have some discussion after the presentation, but there is an opportunity following that where it'll be open up the podium. We'll be there with the mic on. So if you'd like to make some comments or give some input, you're more than welcome to do that. So I'm going to turn it over to Nathan.
Okay, thanks, Ray. My name is Nathan Hilmer. I'm with Smith Group in Madison, Wisconsin. I think this is our fourth trip up for this project. We're about 2 months in, and we're at an interesting point in the project. This meeting is kind of a pivot point where we're going to be transitioning from really the kind of analysis and data gathering phase of the project into exploring conceptual alternatives for the park master plan. So we're kind of calling this a working meeting. Really, it's just, I think, more of a dialogue because we can't really lay paper out and work in this format, which is fine. What we'd like to do is I'll run through kind of a brief summary of work to date with particular focus on what we presented at the beginning of June at the public visioning session. And then what we'd like to do is review the input we've received, particularly at that session and via the POLCO online survey. We had about 420 responses to that survey, so that was a pretty robust set of data, and it's very helpful in guiding this process. And then what we're really hoping to do is get input from these three groups as it relates to your respective focus areas in advising city government. You know, we can go into the documents that you all helped to produce, the sustainability plan, the bike and ped improvements plan, and we can pull out things that we think are applicable to this project. But it's really helpful to get these groups together to understand what the immediate priorities of city leadership are and of these respective groups. So we're hoping that after we have a chance to kind of run through the kind of summary background, run through the Polco, and kind of communicate what we're taking away from all of that data, that you can give us some input and kind of help put the bumpers on it in terms of where your priorities lie. So just kind of a snapshot of where we're at. This is a process that's taking us from early May through September, October. We're 2 months in, and you can see on the bottom there's kind of 3 phases to this project. We are in conceptual design, but we've sort of held off on drawing anything because this is kind of a critical meeting in terms of input. And really, this is the last kind of official input meeting. We'll be back in August, about a month from now, and that's where we're going to present 3 concept designs. So those are pretty high level, and then from those designs, we'll present those at a Parks Board meeting with public in attendance. We'll get input from whomever is interested in offering input, and then we'll focus in on one preferred concept that will then kind of understand what the costs are, how to phase it, what the budget for that would be, and that's kind of the overall process. So even though we're kind of, transitioning into conceptual design, this is really that last official kind of input and data collection meeting. So a lot of you have been in meetings with us, whether it's the Parks Advisory Board meeting or the public input session. But just for those of you who aren't familiar with Smith Group as a practice, we're a multidisciplinary firm, and we sort of specialize in waterfront parks and waterfronts in general. And I think I'm not going to go through a whole bunch of examples of portfolio work, but I just want to stress that, when we're thinking about this project, it's important to understand that the work we do planning and designing the park doesn't stop when we get to the water. We think about that edge, we think about what happens in the water, and we think about the larger ecosystem and the larger watershed. So really quickly, the project site, it's about 70 acres. There's about 4,000 lineal feet of shoreline. We're a little over 2 miles from downtown. And right now there's 12 or 13 ponds on the project site. And right in the middle, you can see the boundary here. This is the boundary of the Oshkosh Corp headquarters. So we have effectively kind of an east half and a west half of the park that are connected by the riverfront trail, and then also a connection at the south. Now, we'll get into all of the Polco data, but I think one of the important things to keep in mind, as it relates to the input that you might have to offer, is the Polco and the public input we've gotten was really helpful, but it's also very focused, and at times it's very focused on a particular thing, a particular program or amenity, or it would be nice to have a restroom building, or it would be nice to have a kayak launch. But I think it's also important to keep in mind the big picture stuff, right? Because this is very much a front door for the city of Oshkosh. It's visible from the freeway. It's just adjacent to Oshkosh Avenue, which is a gateway for the city, and is slated for a lot of improvement and a lot of redevelopment. So as we think about things we want to accomplish here, it's really important to keep in mind what that big picture is and what that big, kind of aha moment is for the city. And then I'll just kind of really quickly go through some of the information that we presented at the public visioning session, just as the way of background for those of you who might not be familiar with it. The site is significant in that it sits within the larger Wolf and Fox River Lake system, and there's a number of significant archaeological sites around the edges of the lakes. On our site itself, there's an archaeological site that was investigated during the development of the Oshkosh Corp property, or Oshkosh Corp headquarters development. And it's also significant because of its connection to this waterway system from Lake Winnebago all the way to the Mississippi by way of the portage at Portage. So really, culturally and historically, there's a lot of important things that happened around this lake system and river system. And moving forward in time, I don't want to do a deep dive into things like, you know, the zoning and transportation analysis and things like that, but it is worth noting that, you know, DNR is tracking how vulnerable this water system and lake system is to climate change, and that's something to keep in mind in terms of, you know, the scale of the project and what it can contribute to improving water quality in the lake, and just kind of being a catalyst project that might inform future projects of similar scale or similar type. And then in terms of the site itself, just physically, you know, the big takeaway for us when we started to look at it in kind of a finer grain of detail is that the bones of the golf course, you know, as they still exist today, very much dominate the landscape out there. So you can see all these orange arrows. These are basically the hole alignments, right? The tee to green with the fairway between. And you can see they all kind of zigzag back and forth, but they effectively parallel the shoreline. They never take you to the shoreline, right? So there's this physical structure of the existing park that's kind of working against connecting people to the water, which is interesting. And then especially at the west half of the park, the traffic noise and the presence of the freeway is pretty extreme, but we found that it's very contingent on how high or low you are relative to the freeway. So if you're standing on top of a hill, the freeway is super noisy. If you get down in a bowl near one of the ponds, it's actually, you know, it doesn't bother you that much. And, you know, those things inform when we start to think about what goes where and how we're going to manipulate the land. Those are important things to consider. And then at the public visioning session, we also kind of had a series of prompts to get people to think about, you know, potential things or program elements that we could put in the park. So this was one example of a board that we had on display. And then we tried to get at things that were a little bit less specific and a little bit more intangible. So this idea of, you know, what would your guiding principles for the park be? How would you measure this park being successful? How would it be successful to you if it did what to the local ecology, or what to the one sense of human spirit in the community, that sort of thing. And we got a lot of feedback, and it was interesting to see, you know, there's always outliers, but really we just pulled a handful of quotes from the sticky notes here, but really these things they kind of fell into different buckets, and they had a lot to do, interestingly, with sustainability, natural plantings, you know, enhance nature, preserve openness, provide trails, respect Native American culture. You know, there was a lot of mention of providing an educational component, or this park potentially being a destination for school trips. You know, things like prairie and marsh restoration, native wetlands. And then there's also, you know, pragmatic comments too. Don't duplicate what other parks have to offer. Provide things that are easily maintained. And then when we got to that idea of success, you know, things like local art, spaces for social connection, promote and inspire wellness, these started to get at those more, I think, community-oriented goals that are less about things and more about what we want the park to do. And then people also voted on the practical things too, and it tended to have to do, again, with kind of restoration, basic infrastructure, trails. Really it's about creating an outdoor space that's connected to nature that people can access, was I think, a kind of a coarse way to summarize it. And then when we went into that public visioning session, we had only had the Polco data for a couple days, so we didn't have enough time to really thoroughly process it. So we've kind of gone through that, and I think you had some packets that were distributed with some of that information. Just in terms of demographics, this is like boiling it way down, but most of the respondents were City of Oshkosh residents. 86% were between 25 and 64, and this is the kind of finer grain detail breakdown of that. And about half of the respondents had children, and the age range in the survey for kids was 5 groups, ages 0 to 2, 2 to 5, that kind of thing. And the kids were distributed pretty evenly across that spread. So no one thing really jumped out too much there, but it does seem we're hitting our target demographic in terms of who we want to solicit responses from. And I'll show you kind of a bigger version of this, but so what we did with the Polco is we asked people, how do you use the park now and what do you want to see in the park? I mean, really, generally, that's how the survey worked. So this is current park usage by activity, and in this bar graph on the right, the red is things that people don't do at all. So, so for example, field sports, a lot of respondents said they don't use the parks for field sports. They hardly ever use them for field sports. That's obviously tied to the people responding to the survey. We know ball fields are well used throughout the park system, but that's kind of the data returning via this vehicle. And so if we kind of zoom in on that, this whole how do people use parks today, so at the left end of this graph, we have daily, then weekly, then weekend, monthly, a few times a year, and never, right? And then these are the activities. And really the ones that spike were the things, spike in terms of frequently happen by respondents. Regular use for walking, connecting with nature, cycling, picnicking, so very passive uses of the park. Infrequent uses of the respondent group was fishing, court sports, field sports, and boating. So you can see how things are starting to kind of slot into place there. Park usage by time of year. Even though we did get some feedback in terms of comments on we would like to see more, things like snowshoe trails and cross-country skiing. Most of the respondents of the Polco did use the park in the summer. So the blue is summertime use, so daily, here's weekly, and then the orange is winter use, so a few times a year and never, so people tend to use it during the warmer months, which is not surprising. And then this is getting us, now we're transitioning into how do people rate potential park features. So we gave them a list of things that could be included in the park, and we always gave them the opportunity to comment things that weren't included. So these things included habitat restoration, water access, community gathering spaces, trails, pathways, etc. So I guess the way to think about it is these are the things, and then the next question kind of got at activities and use. How do you use the things? So here we saw a strong preference for restoration, trails and pathways, basic infrastructure being defined in the survey as restrooms and wayfinding as examples. Recreation amenities, which in the survey was defined as playground equipment, ice skating, exercise equipment, so sort of smaller scale, not recreational sport fields, but kind of smaller scale opportunities, and small event spaces. And then preferred activities, so this is things you do in the park, not necessarily, it's the way you recreate, not what you want to see when you recreate, I guess is one way to say it. There was a strong preference for running, walking, biking, picnicking, community events, learning, exploring, boating, and open play. So just kind of, unstructured. Think about it as a big field you could kick a ball around in or throw a frisbee around in or play bags or what have you. So again, very much in that kind of passive recreation realm. And then in terms of preferred events, this was interesting because it seemed like these sort of aligned well with what we were getting in the sticky note comments related to things like wellness and developing, community spirit and things like that, because The preferred events that scored high were educational events, cultural events, and small-scale performances and outdoor concerts. So really things that bring people together and bring people to the park for the sake of learning. And then I think this is the last Polco summary slide, which is how do you get to Lakeshore Park? The vast majority of people say they would drive there, right? So very telling in terms of how the park needs to respond to that need. So also maybe slightly more subjective because it's not kind of a, the multiple choice question, but we also had comment cards out. We actually had them out at the State of the City, and then we had them out again at the public visioning session. And we just kind of tallied up how, the topics mentioned in all of those cards. And the things that ranked the most mentions were public art, followed by trails, nature, and so on down the list. And again, you can kind of see that these things are getting at those ideas of, getting out in nature, recreating in nature, this idea of public art, which also speaks to that idea of community and identity, which is interesting. And then this was kind of our course way to summarize what we're hearing and learning about how the community is imagining the future of this park. So prioritizing passive recreation over active, and active in this sense just being, sports, right? Focus on the importance of native habitats and ecosystems, promoting art as a significant component, highlighting the importance of community, and acknowledging and respecting history and culture while educating the community. Those were our kind of 5 bullets to try and capture what we are seeing in terms of the overall thrust of the survey. And I just have a few more slides, but feel free to jump in if anybody has questions. So I mentioned that we're at kind of a interesting point in this because I think typically at a couple months into a project like this, we would start to draw stuff, right? It's kind of hard not to, like after the first meeting. But Ray has helped us kind of structure this very robust input process. So instead of drawing stuff, we've been thinking about how do we translate all this public input into things that find their way into the park. And this way of categorizing things as threads, moments, and places is how we're starting to think about everything. So threads are things that kind of were frequently mentioned in the Polco and in the comment cards that you can think about as connectors or linear elements in the park. So, a rec trail or an art walk is an obvious connector, but there's also other connectors like habitat corridors or wetland corridors. You can imagine stringing the ponds together with a series of wetlands that both becomes kind of a visual amenity and an amenity for people who might be interested in birding and things like that. But also, it could serve as infrastructure for the city and the neighborhood if it's designed as such. And then this idea of moments. So these are they're either points along those threads or they're points where you kind of transition from one thing to another. So something like an interpretive node or a fishing platform or a water access point, right? It's not really a space that you occupy as a group, but it might be a space you occupy, as an individual if you're fishing, or, as you transition from your car to the water if you're launching a kayak, something like that. And then this idea of places. So these really get at that idea of the community building component that was mentioned frequently. So this would include things like an event plaza or pavilion, a flexible lawn, a pond, parking lot. And the advisory park board has seen this before. So this is kind of going back to a few slides that captured some of our initial impressions and observations, but it's interesting to think about these things within this context of this kind of thread, moment, place vocabulary that we're starting to develop. So one thing that jumped out at us about the site right away was the 13 ponds, right? And the image that you see here on the right, this is a 1937 aerial of the project site. And highlighted blue here, this is the kind of meander of an old slough from the river back when the river was low before it was dammed, because this is a high point on the site. So this idea of leveraging that kind of remnant slough or remnant meander of the river as one of those threads, it starts to speak to habitat restoration, it starts to speak to connections, it starts to speak to history. So what we're trying to do is look at what the Polco is telling us and identify things that we're going to get a lot of bang for our buck, right? Because we don't want to string a bunch of ponds together and only do one thing with it. We want to leverage that investment to do as much as we can. This idea of edges, I mentioned earlier, there's about 4,000 feet of shoreline. There's also a really significant kind of, soon to be developed edge along the south edge of the site, this yellow line here. There's also the interface with the adjacent parks, which is really important. I mean, those parks are effectively an extension of Lakeshore. And then there's also the Oshkosh Corp edge, which, the interface between the park and the Corp site is going to be very interesting too. But thinking about how within those edges we define moments so that it's not, those edges aren't barriers, right? They become something that people go to and can kind of leverage as a recreational amenity. And then lastly, we called this split personality last time. I gave it a nicer name this time. So there's this kind of duality of the site, right? This big block in the middle is the Oshkosh Corp site. And there's kind of this east and west lobe, kind of two halves of the park. And, we have the opportunity with the riverfront trail to make a strong connection at the north. That's happening. We also have an easement at the south that's going to provide a strong connection. But the interesting thing here, when we think about all of the input that we've received from the public in terms of the places, so kind of the things with the big footprints, the fact that the park has two halves is actually an opportunity because it alleviates some of the issues with potential conflicts between things. So for example, the west half of the park, we've been starting to talk a lot about as the place where you go to get away, right? It's a little bit more introverted, there's less development there. It doesn't make sense to put a bunch of parking over there when there's already so much activity that needs parking off Pinoqua at Rainbow and Mary Jewel. So, you can start to think of some of those more quiet, more contemplative activities finding a home in the west half of the park, whereas the east half of the park, by virtue of its connection to those other existing parks, the fact that there's infrastructure and vehicular access at Pinoqua, the fact that, if we were to build kind of a gathering place, whether it's a plaza, whether it's a building, that building could leverage the adjacent parks. If you had a family reunion, for instance, right, you're at the shelter here, kids can spill out and play ball across the street at Rainbow. So you're getting a lot of dual use there just by virtue of proximity. So that's kind of, I guess, a way to introduce how we're starting to translate all of this Polco info. So what we'd really like to do is, with all of that kind of fresh in our heads, hopefully get some feedback from everybody in terms of, your respective focus areas in sustainability and bike ped, and how do you see the public input informing this process, and what are we missing from that process?
Comments, questions from the board? Any of the boards? And please use the microphone.
$420.
On the online poll, but there were people here that don't.
Right, and
If we could go with the boards first, and then we'll address any questions from the audience.
We're wondering what a flexible lawn is, Nathan. Flexible lawn?
So flexible lawn would just be a lawn that is big enough to accommodate anything from an event. You know, you could set up a tent there, or you could play a game of Frisbee or a game of soccer, but it's not exclusively designated for a particular sport. So, for example, it might be big enough to accommodate a kid's soccer game, and you could roll out a goal at either end and play a game, but it wouldn't be striped as such. It would just be, you know, kind of flexible and used by whomever, however they wanted to.
So it's basically a flat turf grass area?
Yeah, and depending upon how people want to use it, I mean, it could be something like a sand-based turf system that would be usable even after a heavy rain. You know, there's all different kind of levels in terms of how much you want to invest and develop something like that as an amenity. We would typically think of something like that being paired with something else, like a picnic shelter, or, you know, kind of a plaza space, or next to, you know, a boat dock, something where you're kind of getting some proximity to things that are going to bring energy to that lawn and make sure it's well used.
You just mentioned sand. I'm sorry, I can't tell where to hold this thing. It just, okay. Is the whole site more clay-based or more sand-based? Maybe this is a better question for Ray, I don't know.
That is a good question. I don't know offhand. We do have the information, but I don't have it at my fingertips. But I guess what I was getting at with the sand-based is, so sometimes, regardless of your native soils, if you want a turf area to be usable the day after a heavy rain, sometimes you'll just do a heavy mix of sand in the soil profile and then do an under drain system under that. So basically the water just sinks through and drains away, and you can still use it the next day. People often like to use it, you know, at universities, or a lot of our university clients ask for something like that because, for example, if they're going to have graduation on it the next day, they want to know that they can use it even if it's rainy the week before. It's not great from an irrigation standpoint, though, so it's something to consider.
Question?
Yeah. Jim. One thing, when you get into the planning of the trails, I would like to see at least a 12-foot minimum on the main trail along, because of the heavy usage that there will be. The trail along 41 there, that's real wide. I'm not sure exactly what the width is, maybe 14 even, probably 14. But this is going to be very heavily used, so it probably would want 12 minimum, but probably more like 14 on the major route along the water would be very, very important. So we can accommodate all the walkers and bikers and everybody that would be involved in that. Also, you know, it'd be very important to have many spurs that feed into that main trail. You know, that'll be all part of your design, I'm sure, of all that. And some of the concept things that were kicked around at one time, you know, so show some of those. But I think that would be really important. And if for some reason there are actually some sidewalks for some reason that are built and not trails and whatever, I think if they're considering putting a 5-foot sidewalk in a sidewalk application, not a trail or a spur, it should be reviewed whether they want to go with a 5, 6, or potentially 6 foot. Our committee has talked about that, the Bike and Ped Committee, and there are high use areas that we would like to see 6-foot sidewalks potentially used. And in fact, out in front on Oshkosh Ave, it happened so fast, we would have liked that to come before our board for discussion, but the sidewalks got put in, it was too late. And we think with the high usage there, that it would have been nice if 6-foot sidewalks would have been, or greater, would have been used out on Oshkosh Ave, but unfortunately that did not happen. One other thing, and maybe Ray, you can answer more of this. You know, I was on Parks Board for 21 years, but is most of the drainage that's not part of Oshkosh property, is that still in place? Because we spent a lot of money on the golf course doing all the drainage during the last major, thing of the golf course way back. Is that still intact unless it was dug up for some reason?
Yeah, I think we're discovering already with the wet spring that a lot of that drainage system is disrupted. We're finding locations on the existing site where we can't get in and mow, so that's why you're seeing a lot more longer grass out there. Even though you're seeing that at your own home, we're seeing it more prevalent out there, and that's why we're thinking a lot of that under drain has been disrupted at this point.
But I mean, that really helped the golf course a lot when that drainage was put in. I mean,
It was, yes.
Sure. My question that I have is related to the interpretive node, mainly define what it is.
Well, so we got a lot of comments during even at the first advisory park board meeting and at the public input session related to recognizing and acknowledging Native American heritage. At a master plan level, we wouldn't get into what exactly the message of that would be, but I think it does make sense to think about a system, whether it's something that happens in one place on the site, or whether it's a series of things that happen along a trail, for example. The trail, I think, has a good tie. The trail option has a good tie to the freeway crossing interpretive piece. But I guess when I say node, it could be anything from a kiosk with messaging on it to something a little more abstract. But I would hesitate to go the kind of abstract route unless the tribe or culture that we were looking to talk about was involved in the development of that. So, yeah.
I guess I can add just a little bit to that, Nathan. If you want to drag your mouse over that, there's really a node that comes west of the parking lot on the water system, west of our golf course parking lot. So go further east, keep going. Right there, the one that jarts out into the water. I know there's been some discussion of maybe making that one of those potential nodes, because it gets you out in the water a little bit further, and people would probably want to sit there and take advantage of the views. So maybe that'd be a good point for having some of the informational signage.
Okay.
And one of the things that kind of complicates this interpretive overlay also is the fact that the bulk of the known site of significance is not on the city's property, is actually on the Oshkosh Corp property. So it's sort of this area, this high point through here. So, something in proximity to that or as an extension of what's happening at the crossing seems logical.
One of the things that our pedestrian and bicycling advisory board has really been excited about is the opportunity here to highlight some of the connections that the bike path will have in here between 41, the trail, and on the other side between Rainbow Park and some of the greater bike lanes. So I'm hoping it can be possible to really highlight those entrance and exit or entrances on both sides when it comes to that bike lane or the multi-use trail there, and really make that sort of a focal point, because I think that will help really show people that there's another way to get here and use this space so that we don't have to use as much space for parking and congestion that way. If you highlight that, there's parking north of the 41 trail that you can get there just as easily, and taking that into account, so you really highlight how people are using this and how, according to the polling, they said they want to use it. I think that would be really important.
Question. Are all those ponds actually, could they be filled in, or are they Are they springs? Do they fulfill some kind of function, or other than growing mosquitoes?
Taking a look at, let's say, the western portion of the site from Oshkosh Corp., those central ponds, the three directly by the cursor, those are a lot of the stormwater system for the site and for the Oshkosh Avenue redevelopment. So those are really for the water quality and so forth. If you go further to the west, some of those other ones, those are more natural fed rainwater. And what we tried to do when we were working with our stormwater engineers was to keep some of those off the stormwater system, because we've heard from people we'd like to see some ice skating rinks possibly. So by not having that water from the road system going in there with the salt and so forth, it'd make it a little bit safer for possible ice rinks in some of those ponds.
And another question is, has anybody thought of putting some kind of bridge across that watery green area on the west side, so that people would actually look into the water rather than look down into the water rather than out? I mean, bridges are kind of expensive things to do, but there's a lot of requests for being able to see the water and see the aquatic habitat, and that looks like a really dandy opportunity to connect that.
And that's the type of feedback we're looking at. And I think one of our staff members, when we had Smith Group give this presentation before the Parks Board meeting last month, came up with the idea that some of these areas would be great to find a glass bridge. So as you're walking, if you are going to have a boardwalk or a bridge extending over some of the water, to be able to see down below where you're walking. And I know that Smith Group made note of that to see if that's something possible as well.
Yeah, I think that gets into this whole idea of, I like that idea of getting on the water, not just being next to it, right? And there's different ways to do that, and I think exploring the variety of ways to do that makes that edge that much more interesting. So I think that could very well be, so we have to develop three concepts, right? And when we start to think about how we vary those concepts, I could imagine the articulation of the water's edge as one of the ways we vary each of them. So one could be restored, one could be similar to what it is now in terms of revetted, but maybe it steps down and you can actually step down the revetment into the water. And maybe one is more structured with boardwalks and things that get you out, that also facilitates fishing. So it's a good comment.
So, one of the previous slides, you showed a picture of the existing waterways or bodies of water on the site, and then you showed, the 1937 aerial. So, is there just the possibility of just thinking about this, of restoring that body of water throughout the property, like in one flow, where it is, if you see it in 1937, we've now most likely filled in a bunch of that, but if there was the possibility of opening that back up again, that adds another natural component to the park and adds another aesthetic option to that. So did that come out in any of this, or is that even a possibility? I think that's a two-part answer there, so.
Well, I guess one way to think about that has to do with just phasing and when things happen in terms of allotting money for capital improvements. I would imagine, and this is just speculation, right? I would imagine something like that would gain more traction if it was part of a larger scale kind of infrastructure move where, funding would be shared across departments, and that move would provide multiple functions, right? It would be a park amenity, but it also might be expanded stormwater infrastructure for, the neighborhood to the south, Oshkosh Ave, et cetera.
So the irony of that is that most likely to closing that up, there was an infrastructure move to create that enhancement. And so
Right.
I'm talking about, undoing that enhancement. But I think we're in a day and age where undoing that type of enhancement, infrastructure enhancement from years ago could turn into a benefit to the neighborhood and how we manage water within that area as well.
I know that even some of the ponds on the east side of the park, we'll need to get some of the stormwater engineers involved because those are for some of the stormwater retention from the neighborhood. So I think it's a great idea, but it's definitely something we'll want to work closely with them on because they did some reconstruction of a lot of those ponds, and that was based on a lot of the information that they were gathering, not only from the residential area, but from any flow coming off the Oshkosh Corp site as well.
And then just kind of one more layer to that, you know, we don't, to accomplish kind of what you're talking about in terms of linking them again, we wouldn't necessarily have to go back to 1937. You know, we could link them visually and thematically without physically connecting them, right? By virtue of connecting them with a path and with a consistent planting style, and maybe adjacent ponds are, you know, you carve out a shallow depression so that when they're really high, there is a water link, but then when they go back down, there's not. So I think there's different levels of intensity, and so again, going back to the fact that we have 3 concepts that we get to explore, those levels of intensity, I think, you know, are one way to kind of talk about that water system.
I have 3 things that I think the Sustainability Board is really anxious to see happen here. One is involving restoration, one's minimization, and one's mitigation. As far as the restoration goes, with 4,000 feet of shoreline, I do hope that most of that will be planted for shoreline preservation as opposed to, and I totally understand having, like you said in one of the concepts, having direct ways to reach the water. But for the good of the city, it really needs to be restored as much as possible. We would like everybody who has shoreland anywhere in Oshkosh to do that. It would be a blessing for all of us. As far as the minimization goes, minimization, that's a big word. To minimize stuff, I think you should really look at minimizing hard surfaces as much as possible. And Jim, this isn't saying that we shouldn't go, 6 feet or 14 feet or whatever. But what materials are you planning to make those hard surfaces out of? Is there going to be adequate places for the runoff from that to go? Because it will create runoff. And then going to the mitigation factor, the reason I was asking about clay and sand is if there has to be parking on site, which I understand there will probably need to be some, I would like to see that minimized as much as possible though. And if you build parking lots, cars will come. If you build a bus shelter and encourage people to use alternate, and let's face it, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, all this may look very different anyway with fossil fuels and things. But as far as mitigation, I would really like to see pervious surfaces. And if you could do that with the bike paths, with the parking lots, you're going to be able to have a lot more of that without severely impacting the area. So speaking from sustainability's point of view, we'd highly encourage all of that. And I must say, I've been very impressed with the POLCO results and with everything that you've shared tonight. At one point where you showed the in summary, I'm like, hey, I think I wrote that whole thing. So it's looking very positive, but we just want to keep reminding you to remember some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, you spoke about the big picture and guiding principles. Sustainability is all about the future, and the city is going to grow in population, and therefore the use of the park will likely increase. And yet, people's tastes in what they do tend to change. Pickleball was not something very useful 10 years ago. 10 years from now, it may be. So when we think about what is sustainable now, what is of use to people now, keep in mind, please, the future use, and could that be changed? Thank you.
Along those same lines, I'd like to add that the POLCO, the 420 responses, the age group from that was very heartening to see that 51% was the younger group that's going to be using this park. How long is this park predicted to last, Ray? 100 years, yeah? Or Menominee Park. How old is Menominee Park? old. It's older than I am.
I'm glad you answered that, Margie.
You're welcome. It's even older than Lurton, but. But the point is that what we're building today and where people are saying they want, splash pads may not be a thing 20 years from now. They're hot this year, I'll give you that. Well, that was a bad choice for them. They're cooling this year. But I think that nature is always going to prevail. And as things move forward, I mean, maybe you should just be putting in the infrastructure, I think you should be adding some charging stations. If there's going to be a parking lot, it better have a charging station. Because 10 years from now, that may be all we have, so.
I had one more question about native plantings. So that scored pretty high in some of the survey results. Is there a certain percentage you're shooting for, whether that's wildflowers or prairie grasses or marshlands? Is there a certain percentage or other value that you're shooting for?
So I wouldn't call myself a plantsman, but I would say that if it's not turf grass, I think it can be native. So, but it's really all at, there's a whole spectrum, right? We did get a handful of comments that were interested in the idea of botanical garden and kind of a mini arboretum. And I think that that's a perfectly valid application for this site. The advantage, obviously, of native plants is, once they're established, they're adapted to this place, and they require a lot less in the way of input. So I guess our default is always a native palette supplemented with climate adaptive plants. So, and always things that are not invasive.
Along with the thoughts about limiting parking, if we also make sure we highlight access for public transit and a vehicle drop-off, if you're dropping people off instead of leaving the vehicle parked there, I think that'd be important as well, just to show that, again, there's multiple ways to get to this location.
So I guess, just thinking about how we kind of lay out that park a little bit. And you were talking about the west side being the more natural side. And from what I gathered, the east side being the more community use side, where there might be more maybe gazebos or, areas where those field uses that you were talking about, the flexible lawn and stuff, is that being set up that way because of its proximity to the neighborhood that's right there? Or are we talking about balancing a mix of the natural and the use, the community use throughout the whole thing?
So I guess I should say, in the way of answering that I don't think that that's the only solution.
Okay.
We were just talking yesterday about if for example, we advance an idea that there's a pretty big gathering space that might have loud activities or something like that, right? That would probably be more appropriate on the west half, because you don't really have any neighbors except the freeway and a corporation who doesn't have anybody in the building too late, probably. So I think it really depends on the scale of what we're proposing. If it's a small, if the gathering space is a small four-season building that is for birthday parties and family reunions and not large-scale community events, something kind of at the very end of Pinocqua is logical because of the proximity to some of the other parks, and because of the proximity to vehicle access and the fact that there's a building there already, so there's utilities there.
Sure.
So there's a lot of things working in our favor in terms of utilizing existing infrastructure. But I think that's really going to boil down to what are the program pieces that fit into each of those three options.
My other question is related to the development that'll take place along Oshkosh Avenue. And I don't know, that doesn't necessarily come out in this plan, but just thinking about that development and how that's conducive to the development of this park or supportive to the development of this park. So any comments on that? I know there's stuff in the works already, and there's, it's been rezoned to be, beneficial to businesses, hotels, restaurants already and such like that. And we've got a new gas station that's already close to being ready. So what other, are we taking into thought what types of developments support the use and the, just the use of this area as a park?
So we did meet with community development I think it was at our kickoff meeting series.
Could you put the mic closer to your mouth?
Sorry about that. We met with community development during our kickoff meeting series to get the background on the redevelopment opportunities along Oshkosh Ave. As it relates to the park master plan and redevelopment, obviously we're limited in what we can do on Oshkosh Avenue. We're thinking about it more in terms of connections and the fact that if we make a really cool park, hopefully that will catalyze the redevelopment of that corridor. But really, I think it's a matter of access for people, bikes, and cars, and understanding that really the south edge of the west half of the park is going to be it's kind of the backyard for whatever happens there. I actually think that the redevelopment parcels will do more to define the character of the park Oshkosh corridor interface than the park will, because depending upon whether parking fronts Oshkosh or whether it fronts the park, that park edge could very much feel like kind of a back edge if it's just a series of parking lots with storefronts on Oshkosh. So it's something worth thinking about, though, because depending on how that west half is programmed, we might want to work with community development down the road to really understand the relationship between the two halves. So it's a good point.
This question is probably more for Ray, but Ray, and actually both of you guys, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out, but I didn't see anything on here about shelters. I mean, was there a question asked about shelters itself? And maybe I missed it, I'm sorry. Was it a question? And I guess where I'm going with this is we haven't built a decent sized shelter in decades, and we're in desperate need of it, so.
I'm looking, Bill, as well, and I don't know if it was specifically stated as shelter, and maybe Nathan, you're finding it, but I will say that, as Nathan stated, with the existing utilities at the existing golf course maintenance site, that is one area that our department is really going to press forward during this process, is to have a year-round shelter at that site. I think it makes sense. It's something we get a lot of requests from citizens for. And I think having it close to the water and having a view that, whether it's winter or summer, that it'd be a great site for it, and we already have the existing utilities. So that's really the only thing that us from our department are really gonna make a push for at this point. So I think your point is well taken. And I think we can do it real nice, that we can have an open shelter on the end as well, so that the restrooms are available to the ball diamond across the street. So there's a lot of different things we could do with a nice year-round facility there, I think.
Yeah, and I think just some scattered shelters, kind of like at South Park, where we keep them small, and I mean, when don't we rent out a shelter? I mean, don't we rent all of our shelters out every weekend? Yeah, so I mean, there's complaints I get are there aren't enough shelters, so just keeping that all in mind. Thank you both.
Wanted to follow up just about the businesses and some of the transition areas, because you talked about the edges a lot. I had read that a lot of those businesses were going to be fronting Oshkosh Ave, and then the parking would be in the back, and then having even more parking on the other side of the park some of the transition areas to the businesses and people taking parking spots at the businesses could be a concern. And then also, that area, I do love the idea of having to be very, trying to enrich the wildlife and be more natural. And I was just more curious to see two things. Is there a formula that you look at for amount of parking spaces for a parcel this size, or does it depend on what the use is? And the second thing is, what other things have you found success with as to not have some of that wildlife that comes in there then starts coming into those businesses? Because I'm going to assume the dumpsters will then be in the back of those businesses, and even along Oshkosh Corp. To become too natural, which I do love the idea of that. How do we circumvent some of the unwanted pests then coming into the businesses and even the homes along that side?
So the parking issue, I think, so Ray mentioned that the parking is proposed on the backside of the businesses on Oshkosh, which makes a lot of sense for street presence. We've always been talking about the idea of the west half of the park having a small satellite lot, and sometimes people have described that as more of like a kind of like a trailhead parking lot almost. I'm sure whatever businesses are going to be on Oshkosh would also sign their lots, but between the on-street parking and another parking lot at the west end, hopefully that would alleviate that concern. In terms of parking counts, it would really be driven by program. I think if there is, a rentable shelter, the size of the shelter is going to definitely inform parking counts, because there's going to be an occupancy for the building and things like that. Otherwise, I think it would just be a matter of looking at whatever the program is for the preferred concept that we advance, and right-size the parking with the understanding that if we ever needed more, we would have to know where we wanted to put it. So again, kind of thinking multi-phase. In terms of issues with nuisance wildlife and things like that, I mean, are you thinking like raccoons and stuff like that? Yeah. I'm not sure what we could do in the park. I'm not sure that those animals seem as adapted to our environment as they are to the park, so I'm not sure if we'd be making the situation better or worse, but it's a good thing to acknowledge as we move forward and try and think about how to address it if it becomes a problem. But I think the things that we would be doing, with kind of a lot of the comments were concerned with things like riparian restoration and prairie restoration. I don't think those would be a big draw for nuisance creatures, particularly the prairie, because that's more of like a birds and pollinators type habitat. If the ponds were stocked with fish and crayfish and stuff like that, maybe we'd be inviting other things, but we'd have to see.
So another question that I had, thank you for that. In the poll, it talked about some of the winter uses and activities, and I think it's easy to think about parks as in being a summer destination, but here our summers are so short. I think that and some of the respondents maybe don't have an opportunity to go out into the parks in the winter because of the lack of opportunities there. And so if there were opportunities for cross-country skiing and snowshoeing and ice skating and those kind of things, how long our winters end up being. It's snowing in April every year now. We might as well have some more opportunities to get into the parks like that. And so that's something that I think is intriguing. And then I was going to also ask you about a lot of the natural landscapes now in these parks are coming up with more natural playgrounds as far as bouldering and opportunities for climbing and other things that kids can take advantage of that maybe fit into that landscape and be a destination for our area, for children to go and even teenagers to go and climb and have fun, not on jungle gyms, but in a more natural landscape. So I didn't know if that's something that you've experienced in what you've been known to.
Yeah, the nature play and natural playground idea is pretty cool and is particularly popular I feel like in cities, like big cities. I was familiar with a lot of them in Chicago. I think it's a good fit for what we're talking about. It could also maybe reinforce that kind of, dual personality of the park if we decide to go that route. So I think that's an interesting way to think about it, like a more structured playground versus a more natural playground. And then, I'm sorry, I forgot the first half of the question. Oh, the winter activities, thank you. Yeah, so I think the winter activities didn't poll very high, which I was a little surprised by, but that could also be due in part, and this is just speculation, but that could also be due in part to the fact that maybe people don't do winter recreation in city parks because there aren't opportunities. I don't know if there is a park you can cross-country ski at in the city of Oshkosh. So maybe they just go somewhere else to do that, but if they had the opportunity to do it here, they could. And the other nice thing about some winter recreation, if you're Nordic skiing, you don't really even need a groomed trail, right? You can just go. So as long as there's a marked route, people could snowshoe it, they could ski it, and there wouldn't be really any added maintenance or infrastructure cost.
That's kind of what as I think about, because we're adding an awful lot of distance with our path along the lake. And so I support, what Jim is talking about with the width and making sure, because that's going to be the heavily traveled part coming off of the bridge and then over around the lake. And then maybe those trails on the interior of the park could be more, to have that approach that these are going to be able to be multi-year, like all year round trails to be used and to be signed and have path and have it be not just straight lines, but coming in and out of places as you're going through. So to encourage it. And I do believe that if there were destination places to do winter activities, people want those things. So that is something that's an opportunity with this park. So.
Hi, Ray. You knew I was going to talk, didn't you? I got a bunch of stuff, but the first one is, I work for the county, by the way. I'm with County Parks, so I can kind of be a liaison to, as well as Bike Ped. But one of the things that we've had a lot of requests for with the Tribal Trail is a parking area near where Two Brothers and La Quinta is right now. We've met with them a few times, Desiree has too. The trail users park in their parking lot and don't use their facilities outside of maybe the restroom. So having something on that side will make those businesses happy. That was one of the biggest complaints we got with the Tribal Trail was that. Another thing would be how that's going to connect to the Tribal Trail. The Tribal Trail actually belongs to the DOT. They leased it over to the DNR, who leased it to the county, so there's a lot of rigmarole and a lot of different approvals that are going to have to go through it for that connection. So the sooner you figure that out and get it going, the easier it's going to be. As far as uses, from what I've seen in the Polco stuff, there's a lot of looking at the natural stuff, which we have at the county park, which is not too far away, with the cross-country skiing and the snowshoeing and all that kind of stuff. It's nice to have something specific closer into the city. However, I think we don't want to lose the idea that this is a connection of the trail system for transportation as well as just for recreation. So at some point, I think you're going to have people who are going to want to come over the Tribal Trail and get to the south side of town. Do they want to go all the way around to the Rainbow Park, or do they want to hit Westfield and come up? So that may be something to take into consideration, bike lane, something on that roadway, so that it's a transportation artery as well, because I don't see anything coming in the near future that is going to be going down Washburn from the Tribal Trail to pick that up. We're going to have to kind of meander around until we get to the actual nexus of the next trail, wherever that may be.
I have another question. Has anybody considered the acoustic signature of the highway when you're talking about the west side of the park being a quiet area and you're adjacent to Highway 41, which can put out a considerable number of decibels at many times of the day? I live on the river about 2 miles from the highway, and it is clearly audible coming down the river. So when you talk about having it as a quiet area, you're gonna have to deal with the highway noise somehow.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So this little heat map down here, see if I can. So this is based on the topography of the park. And so when we did our first site walk with Ray, we parked over here and we walked up this hill and stood on top of this hill. The high points are red and the low points are blue. And we all kind of looked at each other like, how are we gonna do anything over here? Nobody's gonna wanna hang out over here. And then we walked down, and these are the ponds. We walked down and we walked around this pond, and we actually got closer to the freeway, but it got really quiet because the highland over here kind of blocks the noise, or, you know, as you sink down, it completely changes. So we've been thinking sort of right from that initial impression that earthwork is going to be a really important part of this park for a number of reasons, one of which is creating kind of, I guess, you know, sound microclimates, for lack of a better description. Another is, you know, in terms of that idea of creating an icon or an identity for the city. You know, it feels like there wants to be something big out there somehow, and earthwork is an interesting way to do that. And when I say earthwork, not just berms, but like pretty big, you know, interesting gestures with moving land. And so you can imagine if you were to kind of build a structure here that would create a lower quiet space that was protected from the freeway, you could totally transform that half of the park. So totally agree with you that it's something that's going to be a critical factor on making that west half of the park successful.
Another observation, if you're looking for a signature thing, why not put the City of Oshkosh logo as a metal sculpture on top of the hill? Say 40 feet in diameter.
What do you think? Well, one thing, this actually, the logo identity piece is an interesting conversation because it ties to this idea of winter activity. So one of the challenges with getting people to the outdoors in general in the winter isn't just that it's cold, it's that it's really dark. And it's just, you know, it's not nice to be out there. So I think one of the things that came up most frequently in the comment cards and you know, was highly rated in the Polco was this idea of public art. And actually I think almost all the cards we got at the State of the City address mentioned public art. So this idea of public art, whether it's art being lit or whether it's a light sculpture, could be an interesting way to kind of weave those two things together, right? This desire to have art and create a sense of community identity with local artists or regional artists, but also this idea that visually you want this hook to get people there in the winter, you want this thing that people see from the highway, and so it would start to do all those things. So it's a...
And with a little bit of planning, that the base for the sculpture can make an acoustic barrier that would be real quiet on the other side of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to talk about, and Ray has probably discussed it with you, and I don't totally remember all the exact details of the Rainbow Memorial Park master plan, but Ray, was in that plan, is there still a possible boat ramp at the end? Is that Pinoqua? I don't remember what that master plan looks like anymore, all the details.
No, not at the end of Pinoqua, there was not.
Okay. There was talk at one time of, possibly putting a boat ramp in there. It used to be a beach right there at the end of that street. But there was also kicked around at one time putting maybe some kind of pier, a tie-up pier in there. And whether it's actually in Rainbow Park or here, the vicinity is very, with a road and it's right in the general vicinity. So you might want to take that into consideration if something was ever developed there on that end of the park. So, I mean, that might be one thing to look at. And talking about the trail, I mean, I envision this as a heavily used trail. And with Oshkosh Corp there, I would envision that this is one of these trails, that we like to get out in the winter and do things, and we appreciate, like Menominee Park, they plow the trails there. I would envision this would be plowed. Oshkosh Corp people are gonna, I would think, if I worked there, I would want to get out on a nice day and walk along the nice trail and go up onto the tribal trail and go into Rainbow Park and all that. So I think it needs to be, a hard surface trail, so it's more usable. I mean, it can have the runoff and things we can work into that, but I think it's going to be a very high usage trail, and I think that would be important. And if there are natural plantings, it would be, in my opinion, desirable if they were lower so they don't block the view of the water, so people can enjoy it. I mean, there can be places where you can have higher plantings, but I think people want to look at the water, and it can be accommodated, but try to keep them a little on the lower side would be a good idea.
Just a little note on cross-country skiing. I have my skis outside my patio door, and 2 years ago I didn't get to use them once. Last year I got to use them maybe 3 times. So keep that in mind when you're deciding what kind of emphasis to put on cross-country skiing. I'd love to do it, but you need snow.
I just want to add one thing for everybody. When we're having these conversations about trails and everything, and Jim, I think you know this probably better than anybody, being around the longest, and I mean that as a compliment. But we got to remember maintenance cost on this stuff. We can't keep up with maintenance the way we are. We can't keep up with what we have right now for snow removal, for anything, for grass cutting, for all of those things. So, I mean, the easier we make this to maintain, I think the more of it we're going to be able to do, correct? I mean, that's...
Yeah, that'll be something that Nathan and his team will be working on. Any concept that moves forward, not only will they have the phase-in plan for the development, but they'll give us some general costs on some of the maintenance of some of these items as well.
Questions from the boards? All right, we'll open up to public comment. If you have anything to say, please come up to the microphone and state your name and address.
All right, then. Now? Yes. Yep, okay, here we go. I don't want to get you close. My name is Karen Hartley, and I live on 1711 Pinoquist Street. So, and I've lived there a very long time. I was actually born right there. So I have watched that area of the park, the golf course, for a very, very long time. So I really would like to address the thing about the ponds, because I actually was there when those ponds were all connected. And one of the big reasons for the golf course closing and redoing that golf course was there was a real drainage issue. We had water in our backyard. There was water all around there. People didn't golf on Lake Shore because there was too much water. It was very wet. when they redesigned that golf course, they did redesign those ponds. And from a child's point of view, I was very disappointed because I used to be able to skate from my backyard all the way through to Highway 41, and then we'd skate down the river. And it was a lot of fun. But when they redid that, they took away the water problem. You're talking about moving that earth. They did move that earth to make sure that there would be proper drainage, and that course was the driest course in the city of Oshkosh. And you can still go out there when it's a lot of water and it is dry. You disturb that, we're probably, as a neighborhood, going to go back to our old problem of having water now in our backyards. Also, there is wildlife out there, tons of wildlife that live in those ponds. I see it every day. My neighbors see it every day. So that's another thing I think you're going to be disturbing. So I think you need to have your engineers and storm people really look at that. That area on the, what would be the northeast side, which is where I live, we've done construction on our home, and you don't dig down very far. The plumber said to me, oh my God, the river's running under here. So you have to be very careful what you're going to be doing in adjusting those ponds, adjusting that earth. The water is running under there. Another thing I wanted to address was the end of Pinoqua Street. You had mentioned that there isn't any plan for any kind of a boating situation. Again, I lived there. Memorial Day weekend, there were tons of jet skiers down there. There's kayakers down there. There isn't any place in the city. We have a lot of boat launches, but we don't have any place for that type of small craft where you don't need a specific boat trailer. You need some place for those people to take their jet skis, to take their kayaks, and they picnic there. They use that whole park. I should take pictures of them, but they don't have a decent place in the city for that. The other thing was, and I don't know who addresses this, but I know Margie was talking about the water shoreline. You know, one of the big problems is between Oshkosh Avenue and the bridge, those massive power boats really open up. They're loud, and the waves destroy that shoreline. And nobody has ever even addressed the fact that maybe they should be idling through there, because it is a major issue. So those are just some of my concerns.
I just want to, I'm Paulette Feld. I live at 416 West Fifth Avenue. And I'll just agree with you about the boats, but I think it should be no wake through the whole city, because I live a block and a half away from the river, and it's pretty loud at our house too. So that's something to consider in the future. But I just wanted to address a little bit about the winter use for Lakeshore. I actually did use the golf course for snowshoeing years ago, and it was a great place to go, and I actually learned how to snowshoe out there. I think it would be, especially if it's the western part of the area, I think that would be a really good place to have the natural area. And I think for winter use, the less maintenance that's done in that area is better. Nobody likes to have to cross streets with their snowshoes on, or skis. I presume I don't ski at all. But I think the idea of the trailhead parking lot for that side would address that issue. I've snowshoed in Menominee Park, and one of the issues down there is once you get going, and then all of a sudden you have to cross a street that's been plowed. And nothing's also worse than having to walk across the piles of icy snow that the plows leave. So that would also address the issue of less maintenance in the winter and plowing and that kind of thing. I think the trail along the river probably would be appropriately, plowed or cleaned up during the winter for walking. But probably the rest of it, and this is something you'd have to make sure people understand is to leave that area the way it is during the winter for people who ski and snowshoe. And as you develop that area, the more topography that you can put there, the better, because I think anybody who lives in Oshkosh knows there's no topography in Oshkosh. So being able to climb a few small hills in the winter would be great. I think that's it right now. But I think thinking about the winter use beyond just ice skating, and I don't think it's a place where we would want groomed ski trails. I think, making it skiing for, people who are breaking trails and doing their own thing is what we would want there. But that's pretty much my thoughts. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Shirley Brabander Maddox. I live at 1313 Jackson Street. I think this is kind of an exciting time. We have a chance to develop an area which will be the second largest park in the city, and people have a chance to participate. I'm on the Landmarks Commission, and we became aware of a historic site that was researched by the archaeological team at UW-Milwaukee. And I don't know whether Ray, the city, Smith Group, have you received the final report? Okay, and in the report, they suggested that there was a small area that was eligible as a natural site for the National Register of Historic Sites. And Chip Brown, who's at the Wisconsin Historical Society, who was their legal counsel and expert on historic sites, has retired. And I knew he was going to retire, but I thought he'd hang around long enough that we'd have his expertise. But I did contact the Historical Society, and the woman, Peggy Varigran, that's in charge of the nominations, is waiting for the archaeology staff at the state and the compliance staff to consult about the possibilities, the potential, and compliance that needs to be taken care of. And I'm not sure if Smith Group, with all the work that you've done with water areas around, whether you have dealt with this before?
We have actually. There's quite a great number of sites in the La Crosse on Alaska area, and we've done a lot of work up there and worked with the Mississippi Valley Archaeological Group out of the UW La Crosse.
Right, because I got excited. I'm a retired teacher, and I can think of kids getting excited to think about 8,000 years ago. There were culturals at different times during that period. And they all know about Webster Stanley and about the Emmeline Cook, the first teacher, and about the logs and the whatever. They know all that. But there's kind of an excitement about times to yet kind of re-explore that we don't know much about. And so I could kind of see this as an exciting thing for anyone from kids to academics and researchers. And so I was just hoping that in your planning that area, you're kind of waiting to see what the state comes up with for compliance, and then for some really creative things. But I think it's a great opportunity, and I know in Kaukauna over the weekend, up at the Green Yone Mansion, they have just discovered through magnetic whatever, that I guess they're finding cultures from 1,000 years ago. Well, we can go farther back than that. But, so I just think there's a real potential for another area of interest for this beautiful area. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Bruce Sager. I live at 1703 Pinoqua, so this is my backyard you're talking about. First of all, is there a law against cross-country skiing in any of the parks in Oshkosh? I've lived there 10 years, and I've seen cross-country skiers out on the course every year. I don't know why they couldn't go to Menominee Park or any other park to cross-country ski. I don't think it's a big deal. But parking on the west side, I'll talk about the west side, there is no public parking over there, really. I can see why La Quinta and Brothers and those people are complaining, because there is no public parking, and when Oshkosh Corp gets rolling, you're gonna have 500 people going in and out those two main thoroughfares. So I don't think there'd be a lot of room for parking there either. So that has to be taken into account for the west side, for sure, whether they have charging stations or not. Nodes that you were talking about on the walkway, I think are extremely important, so that people that want to move can move without having to put up with people who want to stop and take a picture or just enjoy the scenery or take a break. So lots of nodes, I think, so that doesn't interfere. My son was in from New York, and they wanted to run down the Riverwalk, down to from where we are, right there at Lakeshore, down to the mouth of the river. And one problem they ran into is it is not marked. So they'd run down it a little bit, and then it's like, now where do we go? Well, we got to go around with Axle there. And then what do we do when we get down to Wisconsin Avenue? It doesn't go through where the marina is. We need good signage on these trails if people are going to really make good use of them. And a lot of people, I think, would go further and use them more if they knew where to go. I've heard a lot of people talk about artwork in the park. I've heard people talk about amazing things that people can see from the highway. I have an idea. Let's put some fountains up in those ponds. You could see them from the highway with LEDs. You could light them up. You could make it like the Bellagio in Oshkosh. That'd be impressive, wouldn't it? We also talked about not being able to mow over there in the park because it's too wet. When they redid the golf course, they made it so the fairways and the greens stayed dry. Right after a rain, you could go out there and play golf. But when you get into the out of bounds and the rough areas, they didn't care. So that might be where your problem is, that when they go to mow and they get off the fairways, they're gonna have problems mowing because it's wet, and it stays wet a long time. Drainage, that's it. Somebody also talked about a year-round building for parties and things. You can put that anywhere. Why take up some of the precious green space we have with a building? The kids are gonna clamber in there, they're gonna have their party, and then they're gonna get in their cars and go home. That, to me, is a waste. Now, somebody over here talked about shelters, and that's an outdoor activity. You're talking about just protection from the sun, from the rain, but it's outdoors, and I think that's a great idea. Let's build lots of those and make use of the park as an outdoor space. You can put a building anywhere you want for indoors, and if your budget is tight, who's gonna take care of that? Who's gonna maintain that building after there's parties and stuff? Unless you could charge them for it, which makes sense. But then why don't they just go rent the space somewhere else from the Y or whatever? So, those are just some of my thoughts.
Hi, Steve Hoopman, 5105 I in Oshkosh. I think I've addressed it once or twice before, but I guess my main concern is 5105 Iameda. And my biggest concern is, again, the parking. We're actually the people doing the development along Oshkosh Avenue. And once a hotel goes and a clinic and looking at probably another 30,000 square foot office building, fast casual food and beverage place, mixed-use professional buildings. The parking that we're doing meets the city codes at one space per 300 square feet of office space. And the thing is, it's going to be used day in and day out. You're going to have 100 guests or 80, 100 guests at the hotel. It's going to be used. And I'm just afraid if there isn't ample parking on the west side, that will become the parking lot for the park. The way the road was developed, there is parking on the north side of of Kaler that was just put in. There's a bike path on the south side, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for cars. That's probably 500 feet, so there might be, 40, 50 cars that would be along the street, along the back part of the street there. So. And the one entrance into the development will be right off of Kaler, just beyond where the curb is up there. So I know we've all talked about the highway, and right now there's actually a curb cut on Rar going down toward Two Brothers. To take a parking lot up along the highway to act as a buffer area with trees or whatever kind of sound muffling, and give you ample 50, 40, 50 parking, parking space lot that would be able to access, that whole west side of the park, and could probably help relieve. And I would foresee art events out there and a whole variety of things going on weekends. But if there isn't ample parking, I don't think you're going to get the people to come there, just because it's not going to be accessible. And I don't see them parking even on Kaler and walking a quarter mile or better, half mile maybe in some cases, to the water's edge. So that, I guess, would be my main concern. But looking forward to having it as part of the overall development out there, and the way the hotel is planned on sitting, the whole north side will overlook onto the park area as well. So. Thanks.
Do the boards have any other questions?
Hello? Okay, this one works. Two things that were kind of spurred by comments that were made. One is, there's that kayak launch area downtown off of, and I don't know the name of that little park.
Boatworks.
Yeah, that's where, yeah. The problem with that is that I've heard from people who tried to launch there that the wake is too great as the power boats go by. So I think that, and I don't remember if that was Paulette that said that, but that is a very valid concern, and it has actually come before the Sustainability Board at one point, and we were told it's DNR and Coast Guard, and it's all very complicated because of where it is. But I'm wondering if that's something the city should be looking at, and I know we have a couple of council members here, so maybe you can put that on your agenda. It would be both helpful to the shoreline and to people in the smaller craft if the larger craft went slower or didn't gun it the minute they're on from under the bridge or whatever. I myself don't like water, so I'm not out there on top of it ever, but And along with that, I think the Sustainability Board could also support having a kayak launch area or a canoe launch area. That makes sense over off this park. Anything with power boats, I don't think it does because we've got that at Rainbow Park, right? Am I right?
Correct, yes. Yeah, when I said there would not be a boat launch, I meant a boat launch that would be similar to Rainbow or Menominee Park. We have had some discussions about a canoe or kayak launch. As Jim had said, maybe a fishing pier off of there with a T or something where we can put an ADA accessible kayak or canoe launch again. So that's something we're definitely going to look into.
Oh, good. That would be awesome. As far as the parking, I just want to remind you that just the street right away has already eaten up a significant amount of the acreage of what we started with when it was a golf course. Again, I would urge you to keep the parking area as minimal as it could possibly be, and still serve the area, and again, to encourage other forms of transportation. That's all. I'm done.
Al, I just want to make sure, did you want to, we didn't want to cut you off. Did you want to come up and say anything? I thought maybe you were going to, thanks.
Where did you get that idea? I'm Al Reppin, born and raised in Oshkosh for 80 years. I originally was born on the bluff, as they would say out there, and moved to 168 West Algoma, which is now 1202 Oshkosh Avenue, or probably Reps Bar, you probably know. We've been there a couple of years. So I'm familiar with the Rainbow Park. I'm familiar with the golf course. My dad was a partner to Hank Detloff. I used to caddy for Hank Detloff, so we're well aware of that Sawdust City area. And in the springtime, the carnival would set up across the street, which is now Rainbow Park. And I'm very well familiar because I set the whole thing on fire years ago. Because next door was Hubert's Meat Market. So it was very even. He was going to bring the hot dogs, and I'd bring the matches to get us started. Have a little weenie roast out there. But West Side Bathing Beach, there used to be tennis courts down there. It was a different era, of course, but parking. There just is no parking now. And in 1981, I put up that backstop, which was there from 1981. Now they're going to enlarge it and lights and this and that, which is fine. You can't park now. Even a couple of months ago, when we had our 1 or 2 days of early summer, like I live on the corner of Rep Avenue at Minoka Street, they're parked in front of our house all the way in Mary Jewel Park. They did a heck of a job. That's very nice. That's Eagle Street. That's very narrow. You can't park there. It's only one lane. They're parking up on the grass there. Nobody's against parks. As I said, I have 7 parks within 6 blocks of me. And, of course, you got the river, and then if you count Payne Lumber or Museum, has 2 more parks. And it's just parking. There's just no room anymore. And what are we supposed to do? Get in your own parking lot, your own driveway, you can't get in. And it's just a shame. I'm not against them, obviously, because in a few years, like 74 years we've been in business, for 7 years, I had fundraisers for this city, including the Grand Opera House, and I put the backstop up and a few others. But anyway, there's just the old adage, you can't put 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. Let's face it, we got to work with what we have to work with, and think of the people that are around you. Sure, it looks nice. It looks nice on paper. It looks great. Oh, it's nice. What they do need, and I know I don't want to take any more green space away than anybody, but if you go down straight to the end of Pinoka Street, when you get to the water to the left, there's that maintenance building, which they have electrical and bathrooms there. But just to the right of that, that would be a perfect place for parking. But again, that's taking more green space away. From there to the, the Nags Ferry. That would be a perfect place for parking. It's away but close. But there's so many things. There just is no parking there. So just, not that I'm certainly not against the city. I think I've proven the things I have done for the city. I'm not bragging, but I've been born and raised in here. I know Oshkosh. So please take that in consideration. So thank you.
So a couple more questions. First, I want to make a comment about parking. I think as much as we probably don't want as much parking spots and large cement slabs where we park our vehicles. There's some necessity to that, and how we reduce that impact is, I think, is an important opportunity for us to here in this property. So, so the idea that we can mitigate that by using pervious surfaces or surfaces that take in the rainwater and then filter it out where it needs to be, I think are really important. So I don't think that not having a parking lot to support this park is not feasible. So, but with that said, I think it's feasible to put parking lots on the edges of that. I would not want like a parking lot in a central point inside of the park. So I'm pretty sure that we're not thinking about that. But the spot on Pinocchio is a good spot. I have a question about, can you zoom that slide in further, please? What is that, the southwest corner there by the La Quinta there? There's a structure right there. Is that our structure?
Yeah, that's our, we call it our Rath Lane building, and
Okay.
actually, we've internally talked that would probably be a good spot for a parking lot.
Sure.
Because you've got an impervious surface and,
Yeah,
so-
and, that's not a big spot right there. I happened to work when that was a big boy. I used to work there many years ago, so, I'm familiar with that spot. I tried to work, I should say. So, but I think that's a natural spot for something like that. And so those are the kind of the areas, and I kind of see that area, depending on the type of development that takes place in that area too, having an impact on parking. Mr. Hoopman answered your question about how many parking spots, the square footage that initiates that. So, my next question, moving on, is connectivity all the way around that site as well. I'll be honest, I have not ridden or used the tribal walkway or parkway that goes across Lake Butamore, so I'm not that knowledgeable on it. But I'm interested where there would be entry points along the park there, along that parkway.
Well, so one thing we've been talking about is the Riverfront Trail comes through, and this is an obvious point of connection that we want to address, and what phase that happens in. Are they going in now? Oh, so the Riverfront Trail will connect to it here. The idea of a parking lot here serving both the park and serving as a trailhead lot, I think also makes a lot of sense, and it's a quick connection to that intersection point. So it strikes me as a pretty straightforward way to leverage parking to address some of those needs.
So from where we say a proposed parking area or trailhead, would we then think about creating a trail that would go up that would also connect to that trail, to that parkway at all, or not, or
Yeah.
that would stay within the park?
Correct. No, so there'd be a point of connection from this parking lot trailhead, a multi-use trail connecting up to that.
Okay.
I think a park of this scale, we typically think of some sort of perimeter loop.
Sure.
That would be a multi-use trail system, or part of a multi-use trail system, and it would also facilitate maintenance for parks. So is the pathway wide enough that they can drive a pickup truck around and do maintenance, and also wide enough to facilitate passing bicycles and that sort of thing, so.
Okay. A couple more questions, so bear with me. Going back to that area on Pinocchio, I know in a recent council meeting, we discussed the addition of keeping the option for lighting over there in that area. And noting that there wasn't enough parking there already to support the ball field that's there. And in our discussion, there was talk about, how this transformation of this park and that area might be supportive of the other uses in Rainbow Park. So I guess my thought is that something that you think goes right along with what we're working on, Ray? Is that something that you foresee as being supportive of that?
You're talking parking now, or you're talking lighting?
Well, sorry, the context of the conversation was around lighting, but it was also, there was discussion of there not being enough parking in that area already.
Yeah, and we've had many conversations with the neighbors there, and we said this has to be addressed as part of this planning system. If you recall, and you might have been on the Parks Board when we adopted the Rainbow Park Master Plan.
Yep.
Memorial Park, I'm sorry. And on that north end where Mr. Rep is talking about possibly having parking, we had looked at having a shelter, or a shelter with enclosed storage for the off-season,
Yep.
for golf carts to be stored there, because at the time there was a golf course, we were hauling golf carts down to Red Arrow and other locations.
All over the place.
So now that the golf course is no longer operating, really that north side of the Rainbow Plan is almost defunct at this point. We don't need a shelter there any longer because it was mainly for the golf course. We do need a shelter somewhere, but should it be across Pinoqua now and have parking where the shelter was going to be? So I think that'll, and Nathan and his staff are very well, they've been part of a lot of those discussions. I made sure to keep them in the loop, so I think it has to be addressed. It's got to be one of the first things we look at before we encourage people to use the park.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty early on, the whole north end of Rainbow was kind of fair game, right? In terms of thinking about it cohesively with Lakeshore, so that we're not, you can't really, they're so closely tied to one another, you can't really separate them.
Okay. And then I got one more thing, and then I'll pass on the mic. So, Mrs. Brabender Maddox brought up the historical restoration site in regards to the Native American communities that were there previously 8,000 years ago. I think that's an important element of this park. And I think if you were to specifically ask that question to the community about that, I think you'd get a lot of really positive feedback about inclusion of that into that project, because that was a lot of the banter that was around there once construction started and once what was found. I think that would go a long ways to making a segment of the community a little bit happier about the context of how everything took place with the park. So, and I think there's an educational component to that. We have around our city, we have some small historical markers of where, the yesteryears of where Native Americans were and where the Europeans met them and worked with them. This one's a little bit different than that. This is several hundred, thousand years before that. And I think that's a really important thing to memorialize in our community. And it goes a long ways, not just for educating all sorts of ages in our community, but it also goes a long way in recognizing the generations previous to us in regards to that. And so I'd want to encourage you to work in trying to get on that historical register and to work with whoever you need to work with to make that happen. I think it would be, I think the community would enjoy that aspect of that. So thank you.
Or questions from any of the boards? Then this part of the meeting wraps up, so the pedestrian and sustainability boards can leave. And the Parks Board, we have another item on our agenda.
I just wanted to say thank you all for the comments and the input, and everybody in the audience too. Thank you.
Pat, can you get the screen back up? We do have something that we need to show for Park Board.
Oh, what are we looking at that for?
Talked about earth moving?
Yeah.
Parks gonna be
Well, while we're trying to work on the technical things, this item for the Advisory Parks Board is to recommend amendments to Chapter 19, Section 19-4T, defining Bowen Street Fishing Dock Park. As we try to get the maps up, what I want to explain to everybody is before Bowen Street was reconstructed a few years back, the Bowen Street dock actually came right off the back of the curb, basically. So it was easy to define what Bowen Street Fishing Dock Park was. With the reconstruction, there is actually green space now added at the end of the cul-de-sac. So there's a path going from back at curb up to the dock, and then in that area, call it the terrace area behind the curb, there's now green space. The neighbors there have been very good to work with. They years ago, when the dock was put in, they did convince the council at the time to have the park hours so that it ended at 10 o'clock. And that was because it's pretty much their front door and they didn't want people hanging out there long. So one issue that they brought up that has been taking place, and thank you, Nathan, for bringing that up. So if you take a look at the picture on the left, it's from 2008, and you'll see that essentially, like I said, the back of curb really butted up to the dock. And now, if you look at 2018, we've got that green space. And what's taking place is people that know the city code are saying, well, you're saying the dock is off limits at 10 o'clock. I can still use this green space, and they're down there fishing and doing other things. So the neighbors have requested that we better define what Bowen Street Fishing Dock Park is. So what we have done, and what we'll do is ask for a recommendation from this board, and we'll need to take it to the Common Council because it's a municipal code amendment. We would need to have the council have 2 readings on that, so it'd be for 2 meetings. But essentially what we'd be doing is defining the park area is that part of the right-of-way from the back edge of the Bowen Street curb towards the water, including the dock extending into the water. The entire area will close at 10 p.m. So it really helps us define the park site. It helps the police department when they have to go out if there's issues to say you cannot be in this site at 10 o'clock. So, go ahead, Tony. Microphone?
What is the definition of the shoreline across that side? Is that still park, or is it private property, or what is that?
That's actually private property. There's a facility, I think an assisted living facility on the west side of that road, and that is their property, and actually they have written on some of the stones there, keep out private property and so forth. So the dock or Bowen Street Fishing Dock property would be essentially, again, from the cul-de-sac areas, including that green space.
We'll post that obviously down there as well, right? Put a sign making it real clear.
Yes, there's signs down there, and what we'll do is we'll pull them closer to the back of curb at this point.
So, I actually have no concern with what you're proposing. I just have a question. Is there more parking available down there now? Is that an issue as well, or? Because that street's bigger now.
When the road was reconstructed, that was a big part of discussion by the residents. There's no parking on the west side. There's limited parking on the east side. And it was heavily debated during the process with the council. So I don't know exactly how many spots, but it's limited.
Sure. So what we're really seeing there is the cul-de-sac area right there.
Correct.
got it.
Yeah, and there's
Okay.
no parking in that cul-de-sac area, obviously.
Okay.
I'd like to motion to recommend this amendment.
Second. Aye.
Aye. I don't have it on the agenda, but I'd like to remind this board and the public that we have 5 concept ideas for replacement of Little Oshkosh out on the POCO site to take a look at. I think we had 8 different vendors provided a variety of designs. So the POCO site, you can go out there if you're not signed up on POCO, go to the city website, sign up. It's a citizen engagement tool for everybody, but you can vote for your favorite one there. That site, or the POCO survey, will be out till later this week. And then also tomorrow night is the Tuesday night concert series down at the Leach. So that begins for the next 6 weeks. And what we're planning to do is we'll have the 5 design ideas down at the Leach so that people can come down there and give us their input as well. So if you want to come out, it's going to be a nice night, and share your ideas on those thoughts as well.
Ray, I was down at 6th and Idaho today, so pass along to your guys. That place looks amazing. So tell them they did a great job down there. I had a chance to talk to a real mixed crowd of people using the park down there. So they're very, very pleased. So nice job.
Thank you. I'll let them know.
Board? I know. Anything else?
I make a motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.